Lakota chief's last warrior fell at the river. A fleeing widow buried him and stayed for good. The mud was in my mouth before I knew I was down. Cold mud, river mud, the kind that smells like rot and iron and something older than either. I remember the taste of it more than I remember falling, more than I remember the shot, even. Just that cold black mud pressing into my lips like the earth had already decided I was hers and was only being patient about it. I did not know yet that a woman was watching from the tree line. I did not know much of anything for a while after that. Let me tell you what I was before the river, not who, what. I was Chante Chihila, heart kept. That was the name my mother gave me when I was 4 days old, and she saw something in my face that made her believe I would carry things a long time. She was right about that, though not in the way she hoped. My father's name was known from the Powder River to the Black Hills, and I was his third son, which meant I had something to prove that the first two didn't. The first two were steady and quiet. I was the one who rode too fast and pushed too hard and loved my chief with a fierceness that made older men nervous. My father tried to talk it out of me. He was not a hard man. He was measured, careful, a man who understood that most good decisions take longer than you want to give them. He would watch me from across a fire sometimes with a look that was not disappointment exactly, more like a man watching weather approach that he has no way to divert. He told me once that the most dangerous thing a warrior could carry was certainty. That certainty was the enemy of clear thinking. I told him I wasn't certain I knew what was right. He said, "That is exactly what certain sounds like." I was 19. I didn't understand him yet. I understood him later. His name I will not say here. He is gone, and some names you do not hand to the open air when the man who owned them has walked past the horizon. I will call him only the chief. He knew what he was. Every man who rode with him knew what he was. The soldiers knew too, which is why they spent so long trying to break him before they finally did. I rode with him for 11 years. What those years were, I have tried to explain it to people since, and I don't think I have done it well. It was not simply war, not simply duty, though it was both of those things. It was more like belonging to a purpose that was bigger than you were, something that gave your days a shape and gave your skills a reason, and when you did your part well you could feel it, the way a joint fits flush, the way a wheel rolls true. That is what those years were. I knew what I was for. I knew what I was. I was there the morning they came with the paper. I was there when he looked at that paper and looked at the man holding it and said nothing for a long time. Long enough that the man got nervous and started talking to fill the silence. The chief let him talk. Then he said, quietly, in our own language, to no one in particular, "They always bring paper when the talking is finished." He signed it. He signed it because there were children behind him who needed to eat, and he was not a man who chose his own pride over a child's hunger. That is the kind of man he was. He took what had been done to his people, and he turned it into the smallest wound he could manage, and he held it there with both hands so they didn't have to. I watched him put his mark on that paper, and I felt something close in my chest that has never fully opened again. Not grief exactly, more like the last sound a fire makes before it goes out. What the paper meant was that the life I had known was over. The trouble at the river was 3 months after the signing. I will not tell you what started it. What started it does not matter anymore, and if I name names the wrong way, I make enemies for people who are still living. What I will say is that there was a band of men, not soldiers, not quite, men who wore pieces of uniforms but moved like something with a longer leash, and they came to a camp where there should have been no trouble at all. People were doing what the paper said. People were staying where the paper said to stay. Those men didn't come because of any trouble. They came because the land under that camp had something in it they wanted, and paper or no paper, they meant to have it. There were 7 of us between those men and the camp. 7. I was the last one still moving when they pushed us back to the river. The Cheyenne River in late October is not a thing you want to fall into. It's low, but it's cold in a way that doesn't feel cold at first. It feels like pressure, like the water is squeezing you, and then a few seconds later the cold arrives all at once like a door slamming. I went in from a shot that took me high on the left side, just under the shoulder. The ball went through. I knew that because I could feel air where air had no business being. I hit the water and the cold hit me, and I thought, in a strange and very clear way, so this is how it ends. I got myself to the bank, I don't know how. I have no memory of swimming, only of finding myself face down in the mud with the sound of the river behind me, and the sound of those men somewhere above and back, and the light going strange. I did not hear them come to the bank. I must have looked dead. I expect I looked very dead. She came out of the trees maybe an hour after the men left. That is what she told me later. She waited an hour. She had a shovel. That is the part that makes me smile now when I think about it. She came with a shovel. She had seen me go down from wherever she was watching, had watched the men look at me from a distance and decide I was done, and she had thought, I will need to bury him, just like that, like it was a task to get done before dark. Her name was Clara Birch. She had been Clara Sumner before that, and before that she had been Clara Me Dowd of Yankton, Dakota Territory. But she told me once that the name she was born with felt like it belonged to a girl she hardly remembered. Clara Birch was who she was. Her husband, Thomas Birch, had died of a fever 6 weeks before this, in a camp 2 days east of where she found me. She was going west because there was nothing left for her east, and she did not know yet where she was going, only that she was going. She was 34 years old. She had one horse, a gray mare named Pell, a wagon with a cracked left wheel brace, a trunk with the things that had been hers before she was Thomas Birch's wife, and that shovel. She was not a woman who wasted motion. What she told me about finding me, she came down the bank with the shovel and she saw I was Lakota from the paint still on my horse, which had stayed. The horse was standing 20 feet off, watching her. She looked at the horse and looked at me, and then she knelt down and put her fingers against my neck, and she felt something. She sat back on her heels. She looked at me for a while. Then she dragged me up from the mud line. She was not a large woman, but she was strong in the particular way of women who have done hard work their whole lives. And she got me into the grass above the bank, where the ground was dry enough to matter, and she started trying to figure out what was left of me. The wound was bad. She told me later she almost stopped twice. Not because she was afraid, fear wasn't really Clara's way with practical problems, but because she was a practical woman and she could see the odds. The ball had missed the lung by less than she liked. I had lost blood enough that the grass under me was dark. The cold of the river had slowed the bleeding, which was probably the only reason I was still breathing, but the cold had done other things too. She made a fire. That was the first decision. She had been cold camping for 3 days because she didn't want smoke to draw attention. She made a fire anyway. She cut cloth from the inside of her trunk. She had a small bottle of carbolic she'd been carrying since her husband got sick. She worked on me for a long time in the dark with the fire going, and she did not pray. She told me this herself, months later, in a way that was neither proud nor ashamed, just accurate, because she did not find that prayer helped her hands. She just worked. I woke up once during this and looked at her face above me in the firelight, and I thought she was a spirit. Not because of what she looked like. Because of the way she was looking at me, not with fear, not with pity, but with a kind of focused attention, like I was a problem she meant to solve, and she did not see any reason she couldn't. I went back under. The next time I was properly awake, it was daylight, and I was in her wagon, wrapped in a canvas that smelled like oakwood and old grain, and there was a weight across my legs which turned out to be a dog I didn't know she had. A low, tan dog of no particular breed who had apparently decided I was acceptable. Clara was outside. I could hear her moving around, hear the mare, hear the particular sound of someone doing camp work efficiently. After a while, the canvas at the back of the wagon moved and she looked in. She had gray-green eyes, dark hair with some gray in it at the temples, a face that had been out in the weather enough to show it. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "You're going to be hungry." I said something in Lakota. I was not fully in my right mind yet. She didn't react much. She just nodded and disappeared and came back with a tin cup of something hot, a broth from dried meat, thin but hot, and she helped me sit up enough to drink it. And when I spilled some down my chin because my hands weren't working right yet, she wiped it off with her sleeve like it was nothing. I thought, "Who are you?" I didn't say it in any language. But that was the question. My Lakota name I kept. But I had learned English years before my chief had insisted on it. He said a man negotiating should understand the words, not just the tone. And so when I was well enough to talk, Clara and I talked. She was not a woman who needed a great deal of conversation. This suited me. We could go half a day without speaking and neither of us felt the absence as uncomfortable. But when she talked, she said things that meant something. And when she asked a question, she actually wanted the answer. She asked me what had happened at the river on the third day. We were camped on a long flat near a dry creek, nowhere I recognized, moving slowly because she was not yet sure where she was going and I was not yet well enough to ride. She asked plainly without working up to it, the way she did everything. I told her some of it, not all of it. I told her about the 7 of us and the men with the long leash in the camp we were holding the line for. I told her about the shot. She listened with her hands in her lap. When I was done, she said, "The others?" I said yes. She said, "I saw one of them, I think, in the water. I didn't know, I thought." She stopped. I said she didn't need to say it. She said I should have gone to look. I told her she had come out alone with a shovel to a riverbank where men had just left one of us for dead. If she had moved sooner, they might have been watching. She sat with that. Then she said, "Your horse stayed." I said yes, he would. She said he let me put a rope on him. I was surprised. I said he has good judgment. She looked at me a certain way when I said that. Not a smile exactly, something quieter, like a door opening a little. My horse's name was Shunka Thanka Sape, big black dog, which is what we called horses in the old way, and his coat was black enough that he disappeared at night. He was 15 years old and he had been my horse for 12 of them. I had taken him as a 3-year-old from a string my father traded for, and I had made him myself. And he was the kind of animal that makes you understand why people form attachments to horses that other people think are unreasonable. There is a way you make a horse that is different from breaking one. Breaking is taking the horse's will and removing it. Making is taking the horse's will and teaching it to work alongside yours, so that what you end up with is not a broken thing but a partnership. A horse that chooses you because you have shown him over and over that your judgment is worth following. It takes longer. It costs more patience than most men have. But what you get at the end is a horse that stays on a riverbank waiting for you when every sensible instinct he has is telling him to run. He had stayed on that bank because he was waiting for me. I thought about that in the days I spent in Clara's wagon. The other 6 men were gone. The camp we had held the line for, I did not know what had happened to it. I did not know if any of them had gotten clear. I had nothing. I had my horse, my body, a knife I'd found still in my belt, and I had this woman who had come out with a shovel and decided I was worth saving. It is a strange thing to be that, to be someone's decision. I had spent 11 years being the one who did the deciding, who rode ahead, who brought back the word, who went first. The whole shape of my life had been forward-facing, going toward things, choosing the way, holding the line. Lying on my back in a strange woman's wagon, too weak to sit up without help, I had to make peace with being the one who had been found rather than the one who found. With being the thing picked up out of the mud rather than the one doing the picking. It took me a few days. I won't pretend it didn't. But Clara helped with that too in her way, which was not to treat me like a broken thing. She treated me like a man who had a hole in him that was going to heal, and until it healed he needed certain practical things done, and she was going to do them, and that was all. There was no pity in it. Pity I could not have stood. What she gave me was something closer to respect, the respect of assuming I would recover and behaving accordingly. I was up and riding by the end of the first week. Not well, the wound pulled when I moved wrong, and there were 2 or 3 days in there where the fever came back hard enough that I wasn't good company. But up. I rode beside the wagon rather than in it. Clara watched me the first day without looking like she was watching me, which was a skill she had developed to a fine point. By midday she seemed to have settled something in herself and stopped watching. The country we moved through was the kind that gets inside you whether you want it to or not. This was November now. The grass had gone the color of old wheat, and the sky pressed down close some days, heavy and white, and on others it pulled back and you could see so far that the land curved away at the edges. I had grown up in country like this. It felt like being inside a word you've known your whole life. Clara didn't seem uncomfortable in it. She'd been on the plains long enough that the openness had stopped bothering her, if it ever had. Some people from the East never get past that. They keep expecting the land to close in around them, give them walls, and when it doesn't they feel exposed. Clara just looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't need anything from you. I asked her once, when we were stopped at midday to rest the mare, where she thought she was going. She said, "West enough." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means I haven't found the right distance yet." I understood this perfectly. I did not say so. I just nodded and we ate dried meat and hardtack in the cold, and the dog, his name, she told me, was Cal, which was not short for anything, just Cal sat between us and accepted whatever fell his way. There was a morning in the second week when I woke before dawn and lay still in the dark. I was sleeping under the wagon by then, rolled in blankets and my own buffalo robe that I'd had tied behind my saddle, and I went through what I had. I did this the way my father had taught me, not to make myself feel worse, just to know. My chief was on the reservation. The men I had ridden with were dead or scattered. My mother's camp was 2 weeks north, and I did not know if I could get there without running into men who would not ask questions before they shot. I had no food of my own, no money, no standing in the world that the new paper world recognized. I was 38 years old, and I had spent my whole life being one kind of man in one kind of world, and that world had been folded up and handed back as something I didn't recognize. I lay in the dark, and I knew all of this. Then I heard Clara moving inside the wagon, just moving, getting up, the small sounds of a woman starting her morning. The mare shifted. Cal came out from somewhere and put his chin on my knee. I thought, well, this is what there is. I got up and started the fire. She came out of the wagon and found me with the fire going and the coffee water on, and she stopped, just for a second. She said, "You didn't have to." I said, "You've been making fires and cooking and driving and doing everything else for 2 weeks. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "My husband never made the fire." She said it plain, with no particular weight on it, just noting a fact, but I heard what was under it. I said, "Then your husband was a fool." She looked at me a beat longer than the sentence required. Then she went and got the coffee and came back, and we sat by the fire in the early cold and didn't say much, and it was a different kind of quiet than before. Something had shifted, or maybe something had clarified. The way a word will sometimes snap into meaning after you've been sitting with it too long. We moved northwest. I knew the country well enough to keep us off the main routes, which suited us both. Clara didn't ask why I chose the way I chose. She simply drove where I pointed, or occasionally said that crossing looks soft, and she was usually right. She had learned to read ground, which takes most people years to do, and some people never manage it. I was getting stronger. The wound still caught me if I reached wrong, but the fever was done, and I could ride a full day by now without the darkness coming in at the edges of my sight. I had been thinking about my mother's camp. thinking about whether Clara could come as far as the cut in the bluffs north of the Mara River, where the trail forked, and one way went toward her west and the other went toward mine. I had not said this out loud. One evening she said, "You're planning to leave." It wasn't a question. I said, "I have to try to reach my family." She said, "I know." I said, "You could come to the fork. It's safer than the lower route." She said, "How far is your family from the fork?" I said, "A day and a half, maybe 2. There's a homestead half a day past the fork that would have traded goods, flour maybe, salt." She said, "All right." That was all. The homestead was a man named Gerhard Moose and his wife, Astrid. They were Norwegian by way of Minnesota, quiet people who had been out here long enough to know that surviving on the plains required getting along with the land, and with whoever the land sent your way. Gerhard was a broad man in his 60s with hands like shovels. Astrid was small and white-haired, and had the specific, unhurried competence of women who have run households in hard country for 40 years. They saw us coming from half a mile off. Gerhard was at the fence and he waited and he watched us come without reaching for anything, which was its own kind of welcome. I spoke for us. My English was better than Clara's Lakota, which was limited to a few words she had already apologized for the pronunciation of. Gerhard sold us flour and a small sack of salt and 2 tins of sardines he seemed almost embarrassed to have charged us for. Astrid came out while we were loading the wagon and she brought a pot of something, beef soup, thick, the kind you eat with bread, and she said, "You'll eat before you go," in a tone that was not an invitation. We ate at their table. Clara and Astrid talked in the way women sometimes talk when they recognize each other, not about much, about the road, about the weather, about how the mare's left foreleg had been a little tender. Gerhard looked at me with the careful, measuring look of a man trying to figure out a situation, and then he looked at Clara talking to his wife, and something in his face settled. After we ate, when we were at the wagon again, Astrid came and pressed a jar of put-up peaches into Clara's hands without a word. Clara looked down at the jar, and then up at Astrid, and Astrid just nodded and went back inside. Clara put the peaches in the trunk very carefully, like they were made of something fragile. We drove away without saying much. After a while Clara said, "Good people." I said, "Yes." She said, "This country makes some people good and it makes other people something else." I said, "I've seen both." She said, "So have I." The fork came on the 4th day past Moose's place. We camped the night before it at a dry streambed with cottonwoods that still held some of their leaves, yellow and papery, rattling in the wind. I made the fire again. We ate. Cal curled between us in his usual way, one eye open, one closed, monitoring the dark for things only he could smell. I had been thinking about the fork for 3 days, about which way she would go, about which way I wanted her to go. That's the honest truth of it, and I was not a man who flinched from honest truths about himself, even the inconvenient ones. I had been watching Clara Birch for 3 weeks. Watching the way she handled things, the mare, the ground, a cracked wheel brace she fixed herself with a piece of strap iron and a borrowed tool from her trunk. The way she handled people, which was direct and without performance. The way she sat in the evening when the work was done, not restless, not grasping at distraction, just present in the dark the way a good fire is present, steady and warm without asking you to look at it. I had told myself she was simply a woman who had saved my life and whom I owed safe passage to the fork. I had told myself this on each of the 3 days. I was a poor liar when it came to myself. I did not sleep well that night, not because of the wound, which had settled into a long, dull ache I'd learned to live alongside. I lay in my blankets and watched the fire burn down and watched the stars move over the gap in the cottonwoods, and I thought about my mother's camp. I thought about riding north alone. I thought about what I would be riding north to a camp on a reservation, to a world that was not the world I had been made for, to the task of figuring out what a man like me was supposed to do next. A man whose chief had signed a paper, a man whose war party was gone, a man who had been left for dead at a river and been found by a woman with a shovel. I thought about the woman with the shovel. I thought about what it had meant, that she had not walked past me, that she had knelt in the mud of that bank and put her fingers against my neck, that she had built a fire she didn't want to build and cut up cloth she probably couldn't replace, and used the last of her carbolic on a man she had no reason to save except that he was a man, and he was breathing, and that was, apparently, enough of a reason for Clara Birch. I had met a fair number of people in 38 years. I could count on one hand the number who would have done what she did. The fire was down to coals. One of the cottonwood leaves came loose and spun down and landed on the red glow and caught for a second, bright orange, then gone. I made a decision. I didn't do anything about it that night, but I made it. In the morning, I told her about the fork. I said the fork is half a day from here, where the trail splits. The right branch goes northwest toward the Morrow. The left branch goes west toward the Belle Fourche Basin. She said, "Which way would you go going west?" I said, "I'd go left. The basin is lower, more shelter. There's a river crossing that isn't bad this time of year, and after that the country opens up. There are places to settle along the Belle Fourche if a person was looking." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Are you giving me directions or asking me something?" The directness of it surprised me, though it shouldn't have. That was Clara. I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "All right, think about it." She went back to hitching the mare. I stood by the fire and drank the last of the coffee and watched her work. She moved the way she did everything. No wasted motion, no theater, just the clean efficiency of a person who has done hard work long enough that it has become part of her body. She knew every strap and buckle on that harness. She talked to the mare in a low voice while she worked. Nothing in particular, just sounds, the way you talk to an animal that is accustomed to you. I thought about my mother again. I thought about the 2-day ride north. I thought about what I owed my people, my family, the memory of the men I had ridden with. I took those things seriously. A man who doesn't take those things seriously is not much of a man. But I had been sitting with a question for 3 days that had nothing to do with duty, and I was honest enough to name it. The question was simply this: when was the last time anyone had seen me? Not looked at me, but seen me, the actual thing, the particular man, not a symbol or a threat or a dead body in a river. My chief had seen me. My mother saw me. The men I rode with knew me as a man is known by the men who have slept beside him and bled with him. But that was all inside a world that was now, in most of the ways that counted, gone. Clara Birch had come out of the trees with a shovel. She had put her fingers on my neck to check for breath. And in 3 weeks of riding together she had looked at me, directly, without flinching, without the careful blankness people use when they're trying not to show what they think. And what was in her face when she looked at me was not fear or pity or discomfort. It was something else, something I recognized, though I had not seen it aimed at me in a long time. I set down the empty cup and went to help her finish hitching the mare. We reached the fork near midday. The sky had gone gray and low, the wind picking up from the northwest, the smell in it of snow that was still a day or two off but moving. The trail came up over a long, low rise and split at a twisted cedar tree that had been standing there probably 100 years, bent hard to the east by a lifetime of that wind. I stopped Shunka Thanka Sape at the fork and looked at the two ways. Clara pulled the wagon up alongside me. The mare blew. Cal stood at the edge of the wagon seat and tested the wind. I looked at the right branch, the way I had meant to go. I sat there for a while. Clara didn't rush me. She didn't say anything. She sat on the wagon seat with the lines in her hands and she let me think, which was another thing about her. She understood that thinking was a thing a person did, not a gap in the conversation to be filled. I thought about my mother's camp. My mother was a strong woman. She had outlasted harder things than this. My brothers were there. My brothers had always been steadier than me, and they would hold what needed holding. I thought about what I would be, arriving there, the last one back, the one who had been left in a river. Not a failure, no, but not what I had been. I thought about the woman beside me. I had been needed at that river because my chief needed me. I had been needed in all the years before because my people needed me. That need had made me what I was. Now I was sitting at a fork in the trail in November in the cold, and the only thing I was certain of was that somewhere to the left, along a river I knew, there was space for a man to be something again, for his hands to mean something, for his word to stand. And there was a woman who had pulled him out of the mud when she didn't have to. I turned left. Clara looked at me. I didn't explain. She waited. I said, "The Belle Fourche crossing is about a day and a half. The river will be cold, but it's shallow right now." She said, "What about your family?" I said, "They're not going anywhere. I know where to find them, and the reservation I'll get word. I'll get there, but not right now." She said, "Why not right now?" I said, "Because right now there's something else." I didn't say what the something else was. I let her look at me and figure out whether she believed me, because Clara Birch was not a woman who needed things wrapped up for her. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she clicked her tongue at the mare and the wagon started moving. Left. I rode alongside it. I did not make a fool of myself by grinning, but it was close. The crossing was where I remembered it. We made it in the afternoon of the second day, the water cold and brown and about chest deep on the mare at the deepest part, the wagon rocking a little on the stones. Clara stood on the seat, and I led the mare from horseback, and we came out the other side wet to the thigh and breathing hard, and Clara said, very quietly, "All right then," which was about as much as she tended to say when something had gone well. We camped that night on the west bank in the bowl of a low hill that cut the wind. I built a fire. She opened the jar of peaches from Astrid Moo's, and we ate them with 2 forks in the firelight, and they tasted like something from a different season, sweet and impossible in all that cold. Cal had the juice. What came next I will tell you plainly because it's the plain truth, and it doesn't need decoration. Over the following days, 3, 4, I stopped counting the way you do when you're not in a hurry. For once, we talked. Not constantly, but steadily, the way rivers talk, not always loud but always moving. She told me about Thomas Birch, not bitterly. She had not been unhappy in that life exactly. Unhappy wasn't quite the word. She had been invisible in it, not badly treated, not cold or hungry, just unseen. Like she was a piece of equipment that worked well and so no one thought much about it. She said, "He was a decent man. He wasn't a bad man. He just never looked at me." She said it plainly, like a fact about the weather. I thought about all the ways a man could fail the woman beside him without laying a hand on her. Thomas Birch had not been a cruel man. He had been an absent man, absent in the particular way of men who are physically present and emotionally elsewhere. Men who move through their lives filling up the roles, husband, provider, neighbor, without ever asking what is actually happening in the room. I had met men like that. I had ridden with men like that briefly, before my chief weeded them out, because they were liabilities in the field for the same reason. Men who don't look tend not to see what's coming until it arrives. I told her about the years with my chief, about what it had been to be the one who went first, who scouted, who brought the word back, about the pride in it, not a boasting pride, but the deep kind, the kind that lives in your body when you know you are doing the thing you were made for. I told her about my chief's face when he signed that paper, and about the quiet he kept afterward that was not the quiet of peace. She listened the whole way through. Then she said, "You loved him." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not like I mean, the way you love a man who." I said, "The way you love the thing that made you who you are, the way a river loves its banks." She sat with that. She said, "I've never loved anything that way." I said, you might. I didn't look at her when I said it. I looked at the fire. She didn't say anything, but I heard her breathe. There was an evening a day or two after that when she got out a small book from her trunk, not a Bible, a book of poems, thin, the cover worn to a softness like old chamois, and she read out loud for a while in the firelight. I don't know poetry. I didn't know the poem she read, but I liked the sound of her voice doing it, the different voice she used, a little slower, more careful with the syllables. It was a private voice, the voice of someone doing something they did alone and were not accustomed to having witnessed. She looked up once and caught me watching her, and she stopped. I said, don't stop. She looked at me for a moment. She read two more and then put the book away. But the next evening she got it out again without asking, and the evening after that. We did not talk about it. It simply became a thing that happened at the end of the day, her reading and me listening, the fire between us and Cal's chin on my knee and the dark outside pressing gently on the wagon canvas. I have thought about those evenings many times since. There is something a person gives you when they let you see them doing the thing they love in private. It is not the same as any other kind of trust. It is its own kind. There was a homestead we found 8 days past the crossing, a family named Talbert, husband, wife, 3 children, 160 acres they'd been proving up for 2 years. The husband, Frank Talbert, was a young man with the look of someone who had come out here on pure determination and was discovering that determination alone didn't build the fences. He had a north fence down. 2 of his cattle were out, probably heading for the river. I saw the fence from half a mile off. I said, I'm going to look at that fence. Clara said, we have time. I rode over and looked at the post. It had rotted at the ground, poor wood, and the wire had come loose. I had the tools I needed in my saddlebag because I had developed the habit of carrying tools years before. I had the post reset and the wire run and the fence solid in about 2 hours. Frank Talbert stood and watched me work for a while, his hat in his hands, unsure what to make of me, and then he started helping without us talking about it, handing me things when I needed them. When it was done, he said, I don't know how to, what do you? I said, it's a fence. It needed fixing. He went in and came out with a sack of cornmeal and a good-sized piece of salt pork, and he held them out and he said, please. I took them. Clara had already met the wife, a woman named Dora, small and quick-eyed, and they had been talking for the 2 hours I was on the fence. When I came back to the wagon, Clara was smiling, a real smile, not the small polite thing she used with strangers, the full one, rare, that changed her face entirely. Dora Talbert stood at her door and called out, you come back through, you come in. We rode away with the cornmeal and the pork. After a while I said, what were you and Dora talking about? Clara said, things. I said, what kind of things? She said she wanted to know if you were my husband. Something went still in me. I said, what did you say? Clara looked straight down the trail ahead of her. She said, I said not yet. I looked at her. She was looking straight ahead. But her chin was up a little in the way that meant she had said something she meant, and was prepared to stand behind it. I said, that was direct of you. She said, I told you I'd had enough of a life where things didn't get said. I said, yes, you did. She said, well. I said, well. We rode on. After a while I said her name, Clara, just her name, nothing attached to it. She looked over at me. I said, I don't know what the world thinks of what you just said to that woman. She said, I don't know either. I find I don't care much. I said, neither do I. She nodded. Something was settled. Shunka Thanka Sape moved a little closer to the wagon, which he sometimes did when he was at ease. There is a particular quality of light in November on the northern plains when the snow has been threatening, and then finally backs off and gives you a clear, cold day. The sky goes a kind of impossible blue, deep and hard, the blue of something very far away, and the dead grass catches the sun and holds it so the ground glows, and everything is so still and sharp that you can hear the world. We had 3 days of that. 3 days of that light and that cold and that stillness, moving through country that felt like it had been set aside for something. I had grown up in country like this, and I still felt it that way, like standing in the middle of a long-held breath. Clara felt it too. I could tell by the way she sat, the way she looked around and didn't look away. She was a woman who was good at being where she was, which is rarer than people think. One afternoon, she stopped the wagon on the crest of a low rise and just looked west for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "Here." I said, "What?" She said, "This is the right distance, right about here." I looked at the country ahead. The Belle Forge ran through it maybe 3 miles on, a dark line through the gray and gold. Cottonwoods along the bank. A long flat south of the river with good shelter from the northwest, 2 low bluffs bracketing it like arms. Good grass even now, dried but deep. I said, "That flat down there." She looked where I was looking. She said, "Yes." I said, "The soil would be good. Sandy loam, you can see it in the cutbanks. River's dependable here year-round. There's limestone in that east bluff. You can build with limestone." She said, "You know this country." I said, "I've ridden it for years." She said, "Would you build here?" I looked at the flat for a long time. I said, "If I was building somewhere, it would be a place like this." She said, "It doesn't have to be like this. It can be this." I turned to look at her. She was looking at me. Not sideways, not careful, straight at me the way she did when she meant something fully and without half measures. I said, "Clara." She said, "I know what I'm asking." I said, "You know what it means for you, people talking." She said, "I've been talked about. I'll survive it." I said, "You know what it means for me. There are men in this territory who would not leave it alone. The paper says things about where I'm supposed to be." She said, "I know that too." She paused. "Frank Talbert will know people who know how things get done out here, who can file a claim and how to do it and who to talk to. I think Dora Talbert is the kind of woman who gets things arranged." I said, "You were talking about more than things." She said, "I told you." I said, "Yes, you did." She looked at me a moment more, then looked back at the flat below us, the river, the cottonwoods. She said, "I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy. I'm not going to tell you I know what I'm doing. I'm 34 years old and I've been wrong about things before." I said, "So have I." She said, "But I know what I saw at that river. I know what kind of man does what you've been doing since you could sit a horse again. I know what kind of man fixes a stranger's fence and takes the cornmeal and doesn't make it into something it isn't." I said, "Clara." She said, "I'm not finished." I stopped. She said, "I know what kind of man makes the fire, every morning without being asked, just because he can see it needs making." She looked at me then, and the light was that cold blue November light that makes everything sharp, and I could see her plain, the gray at her temples, the weather in her skin, the steadiness in her eyes that I had been watching for weeks and had not once seen waver. She said, "I see you. I don't know if anyone has ever said that to you plain, but I do. I see what you are, and I'm not going anywhere." I had been a warrior for 11 years. I had sat with my chief in councils where the words were heavy and the silences were heavier. I had held a line at a river with 6 other men against odds that were never going to end well, and I had not flinched. I had lain in mud with a hole in me, and I had not given in. I sat on my horse in that light, and heard that woman say those words, and I will tell you the truth. Something in me that had been pulled tight for a very long time let go. I didn't fall apart. That is not what I mean. I mean the way a rope eases when the weight on it is lifted. I mean the way a door sounds when the wind drops and it settles in its frame at last. I looked at her for a long time, then I got down off my horse. I walked to the side of the wagon and I put my hand up and she took it, and I helped her down, And we stood in the grass on that rise in that cold light, and she put her head against my chest, and I put my arms around her, and we stood there. Cal circled us twice and then sat down. The mare blew and went back to tearing at the dry grass. Below us the flat lay in the sun, waiting. I will not make the rest of it sound like something it wasn't. What we built was hard. The first winter we finished in a dugout with a sod roof that leaked when the melt came, and we spent 3 days bailing water with whatever we had, and Clara did not complain about it once. We got the limestone house up the following spring, real walls, solid, a south-facing window because Clara said she wanted to see the sun in the morning, and she was right that it mattered. Frank Talbert rode out with 2 of his neighbors in April, men named Cord Prout and Henry Swick, and they helped raise the main walls in 2 days. Dora Talbert had indeed arranged things as Clara had predicted she would. There was a filing. There were papers. I will not pretend the papers were simple or that the world was simple. It was not simple, and some of it was ugly in the way that kind of thing was ugly in those years. But it got done. There was trouble in the spring of the 2nd year. I will tell it plain. A man named Burge came, not a neighbor, not anyone with any standing on the Bell Forge that I knew of. He came with another man I never got the name of, and they came mid-morning when I was out along the south pasture checking fence. Clara was at the house alone. I heard her voice before I heard theirs. She was not calling for me. She had her own way of handling things, and calling for help was not her first move. But there was something in the sound of it, the particular flat quality, that made me turn the horse and come back faster than I'd left. I came around the corner of the house, and I saw Burge leaning against the wagon with his thumb in his belt, and his partner standing close to Clara in the doorway in a way that put her between him and the inside of the house. Clara had her arms folded and her chin up, and she was looking at the man in the doorway with that expression of hers, the one that said she had already assessed the situation and found it manageable and was mildly irritated to have to deal with it. I got down off the horse. Burge looked at me. His partner looked at me. Neither of them said anything right away. I walked to the door. I stood between Clara and the man who had been standing close to her. I didn't touch him. I just stood there and I looked at him and I waited. He moved back. They do if you hold it right, if there's nothing in your face except quiet and certainty, nothing that gives them anything to grab onto or escalate off of. My father had taught me that too, that particular stillness. It costs more than it looks like it costs, but it works more often than fighting does. Burge said they were looking for work. I said there was no work here. Burge said they had been told this was a good place to ask. I said whoever told him that was wrong. I looked at him and I held it, and after a moment he looked away. They left. Clara stood in the doorway after they were gone and watched them go until they were out of sight. Then she looked at me. She said, "I had it." I said, "I know you did." She said, "You didn't ride in hard. You didn't make it worse." I said, "There was no reason to make it worse." She said, "A lot of men would have." I said, "A lot of men are idiots." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for coming back when you did." She didn't say it like she needed rescuing. She said it the way you thank someone for being where they said they would be, for being reliable, dependable, the kind of man who hears the tone in his wife's voice from a quarter mile off and turns his horse around. I said I wasn't going far. She nodded. She went inside. I unsaddled the horse. There are things a man protects by being there. Not by fighting, just by being there, solid and present and known. By being the kind of man that other men look at and calculate the cost of crossing, and decide the cost is too high. I had been that kind of man for 11 years on the trail. I had not known if I could be that kind of man at a homestead on a river in peacetime. That afternoon told me I could. I got word to my mother. She sent back word through a man I trusted, a mixed-blood trader who knew the route. The word she sent back was 3 words in Lakota, which I will translate only loosely. You are living. It was everything she needed to say. I wrote back that I would come in spring, which I did. I rode north alone in May, 3 days there and 3 days back, and I sat with my mother in her lodge, and I told her what had happened at the river and after, and she listened, and at the end she said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Your father would say you have always known how to find your way home, even when home is not where you expected." I took that with me when I rode south again. I brought Clara back north with me in the fall of the second year, after the house was solid and the first real harvest was in. I wanted her to meet my mother. I was nervous about this in a way I had not been nervous about much in years, which told me something about how much it mattered. My mother and Clara had no common language beyond my translations, but my mother had been reading people her whole life, and she did not need language for what she needed to know. They sat together by my mother's fire, and I sat between them and translated back and forth. And after a while, there were long pauses between the translations where my mother and Clara were simply sitting together in the way women sometimes can, a kind of understanding that moves sideways past words. My mother asked Clara one thing directly through me. She asked, "Does he know his own worth?" Clara said, "He's learning." My mother looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, the laugh she kept for things that surprised her. She said something I translated as, "Good. He needs someone who will tell him." Clara looked at me. I said, "I didn't need to translate that." She said, "No, I got the general idea." When we left, my mother held Clara's hands in both of hers for a moment. She said something short in Lakota, looking at her. I started to translate and Clara shook her head slightly, which meant she wanted to hear my mother's words in my mother's voice first. So I waited. My mother said it again, and then she looked at me and I said, "She says, the river knew what it was doing, sending you to him." Clara looked at my mother. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, the way you nod at something true. We rode south with the first cold of October coming behind us. The grass was turning. Shunka Thanka Sape moved well under me, still sound at 16, still the horse I had made. Clara drove the wagon, and every now and then I looked over at her, her profile against the sky, the set of her shoulders, her hands easy on the lines. I thought, this is a life, the specific one, mine. It took a while to know what to do with that feeling, not because it was bad, because it was full. Full in a way I had not been prepared for, like walking into a room you thought was empty, and finding it lit and warm and occupied. There is a morning I carry. It must have been the 2nd October. We had been on the Bell Forge for almost a year by then, and we had made a thing of it, not a wealthy thing, not a simple thing, but a real thing, a place that was ours and that we had built with our own hands and that owed nothing to anyone. I was up early before light, the way I am always up early. Old habit, old training. I had the fire going and the water on, and I was outside in the dark looking at the sky because I do that in the mornings when the sky is clear. I learned the sky as a young man, and I still find it useful and pleasant to know where I am in relation to it. I heard the door. Clara came out in her coat with her hair down, which was not how she usually came out in the morning. She came and stood beside me. She looked up at what I was looking at. She said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "Witchhappy, the stars. That cluster there, we call it the winter count stars." She looked, she said, "Why winter count?" I said, "In the old way, every winter the keeper of the count would add a mark for the thing that had happened that year. The most important thing, to remember. The stars are always there to look at in winter when you're making the count, so they became the name." She said, "What would be on your count this year?" I thought about it. I said, "This, right now, the fire and you standing here." She didn't say anything. She stood close, our arms touching, and she looked at the winter count stars. After a while she took my hand, not with any particular weight or ceremony, Just took it, the way you take a thing you know is yours and are not anxious about. We stood there until the sky started going pale in the east. Then she went in to get the coffee and I went to see to the horses, and the day began. That's all. That's the whole of it. I was left for dead at a river in October, and a woman came with a shovel and found out I wasn't dead yet, and she made a decision. Not for me, exactly. For what she saw, for what she had looked at clearly and decided was worth her time. And I had the sense, when I was sitting at a fork in the trail in the cold, to understand what had been handed to me and to ride left. I think about my chief. I think about the paper and what he said when the man kept talking. They always bring paper when the talking is finished. He was right about that. The talking was finished. The world I had been made for was finished. But I was not finished. A woman with gray-green eyes and a shovel made sure of that. And I have been trying every morning since to be worth what she saw. I think I'm getting closer.